What's up guys, my name is Ace, and the Season 3 update for Modern Warfare 2 came with a ton of weapon balancing, and in today's video, we're going to be breaking down all of this weapon balancing in great detail so you guys can see exactly what changed, since as always, the patch notes are extremely vague here. Now keep in mind, we're only focusing on the weapon changes here. There were also a bunch of attachment changes, and I do plan on covering many of those in future videos. And also, I know a lot of you guys have been asking me my opinion of Season 3, and just so you know, I've been working hard collecting this data, doing a bunch of testing in custom games, and I haven't had a chance to play a single public match of this game since Season 3 launched. My priority is getting the information out to you guys, so you're gonna have to wait a little longer for opinions from me. And without further ado, let's dive right into this, and we're gonna start this off with the assault rifle category. And the first gun mentioned here is the ISO Hemlock. With this, they reduced our lower torso damage values, which, as you can see here, it's now no longer a 3-shot kill without getting upper torso shots. Previously, up close, this was a 3-shot kill even to the stomach, whereas now you need to hit upper torso shots in order to maintain a 3-shot kill. And just overall, it's now going to be slightly less forgiving, and you have to make sure you're hitting those upper torso shots more often if you want to maintain optimal time to kill values. Now on top of this, they also nerfed our ranges, and it is worth noting our maximum damage range was unchanged, but our other 2 damage drop-off points were changed by a noticeable margin, so you may notice that the ISO isn't quite as competitive in those longer range engagements now. Now on top of this with the ISO, later in the patch notes, they adjusted the 300 blackout ammunition specifically. In our 3rd damage range, we got a buff across the board to our damage values, and with this, we can now get a 3-shot kill potential within that range to the body, whereas previously you couldn't do that without headshots. And speaking of headshots, we also saw a buff across the board, with the one exception being the last damage range. So overall, headshots are going to be a little bit better now with 300 blackout. Additionally, when using 300 blackout, they actually very noticeably improved our hipfire spread while prone. And as we can see here, this is pre-patch, and we're gonna just fade into what it looks like post-patch, and that is an incredibly tight hipfire spread. But of course, this is only going to apply when you're prone. And then finally, with this 300 blackout ammunition specifically, they increased the initial recoil slightly, and they said they increased recoil violence, which is an interesting stat. But as you can see here, pre-patch versus post-patch, there's definitely a little bit more recoil with those initial shots. There's less stabilization there, and you are going to have a harder time hitting your shots with this. Again, this is just with the 300 blackout ammunition. The base version of this gun didn't change in this department. Next, let's have a look at the M13B, and this saw a bunch of damage adjustments, including an additional damage range value here. It's worth noting our headshots were nerfed pretty much across the board here, whereas many of our other damage values were actually buffed, and they equalized our lower torso and upper torso damage. So now you don't need to focus on hitting upper torso shots, you just have to focus on hitting torso shots. So in that way, it is going to be more forgiving overall. And this is definitely a buff overall to the M13B, but I just wanted to show you with this additional damage range they added. I'm not sure why they even bothered. This is such a small range you can see there. They just sort of split that already tiny damage range window and made that 2 different values. You should never notice any difference there, but you will notice a difference in consistency now that you can shoot the entire torso instead of just the upper torso. After that, we saw several really minor damage adjustments to the STB-556, but with this, it turns out, at least at 100 HP, like for regular multiplayer, there are no meaningful changes here. This may slightly impact the gun in Warzone, for instance, but not in regular multiplayer. However, it is also worth noting our 2nd damage range value was just slightly increased with the STB-556, so that is a very slight improvement there. Additionally, we did see quite a few changes to the single tap mod on the STB-556. Not only are you seeing more benefits for using this smaller magazine, that's just a general buff across the board to smaller magazines, which I may get into in a future video coming up, but we also saw a bunch of damage adjustments, more specifically to our torso as well as the head. And with this, in the maximum damage range, it's now a 2-shot kill anywhere in the torso, whereas pre-patch, you needed an upper torso shot mixed in with a lower torso shot for a 2-shot kill, so it's more forgiving in that area. And we do see that forgiveness carry over to many of the other ranges as well. However, they also nerfed our rate of fire potential with this down to about 400 rounds per minute. Now what this means is our time to kill is technically a little bit slower now after this patch, but it's still incredibly fast at 150 milliseconds with a 2-shot kill, and now that 2-shot kill is more forgiving. And it's also worth noting, at long range, it used to drop off to a 4-shot kill with torso shots, whereas now we still maintain a 3-shot kill potential as long as we're hitting them anywhere in the torso. So overall, I would consider this to be a net buff to the STB-556 with the single tap mod. But then finally, with the assault rifle category, we have the TAQ-56. And with this, we saw a very slight nerf to our headshot damage across the board. And when looking through all the various combinations of hitting different body multipliers within different ranges, this is really only going to impact a few situations where you're mixing like leg shots with headshots. For the vast majority of gunfights, you should notice no difference whatsoever when it comes to the TAQ-56. Now, let's move into the battle rifle category, and with these, we saw a lot of movement adjustments. With the FTAC Recon, we saw a buff across the board to all of our movement values. These aren't huge changes by any means, so it's not like this suddenly propels this into like a top tier gun or anything, but it's a welcome improvement here to our movement speed. Next, in the patch notes for the FTAC Recon, they mentioned that they increased our semi-auto leg damage and semi-auto upper torso damage. However, based on my post-patch testing, there was actually no change to either of these values at all. So I think they either mislabeled something or the adjustment just didn't go live. Then with the Lachmann 762, for our base movement speed and our aim walking movement speed, we see a little bit of an improvement there. However, it is worth noting our sprint movement speed was actually very slightly nerfed with this update. After that, we have the SO14, and with this, we only see an improvement to our base movement speed and our aim walking movement speed. Our sprint movement speed was unchanged. And then finally, with the TAQ-V, again, it's a similar story. Our base movement speed and aim walking movement speed were slightly improved, but not our sprint movement speed. And it's also worth noting with this, there was a very slight change to our lower limb damage at mid to long ranges, but this change is pretty much irrelevant. It doesn't really change the gun at all. I don't even know why they bother doing this. After that though, let's move into the LMG category, and with the RAAL MG, we saw a headshot damage nerf across the board here. However, it still maintains a 2-shot kill potential to the head at any range. And then on top of this, they altered our semi-auto damage, which keep in mind, pre-patch, we didn't get increased damage when switching to semi-auto with the RAAL MG, whereas post-patch, we now get a fairly significant boost here. As you can see, we can now maintain a 2-shot kill to the upper torso, even out to mid-ranges, whereas pre-patch and semi-auto, it would be a 3-shot kill. So I would say that semi-auto is actually quite viable on the RAAL now. As for the RPK, we saw a very slight adjustment to our damage values in the second damage range. However, in this case, that slight adjustment is actually going to have a fairly big impact because pre-patch, within that damage range, we could get a 3-shot kill anywhere to the torso, whereas now you have to mix upper torso shots in. And I do find this one to be a little unfortunate. I don't think the RPK needed any more nerfs on top of the previous nerfs we've seen for multiplayer. I think this one was targeted again for Warzone, but unfortunately it hurts the gun in multiplayer as well. In either case, that will wrap it up for the LMGs. Now let's move on to the marksman rifles and the Tempus Torrent that we saw with Season 2 Reloaded. This one caught a few nerfs here. The first thing is they nerfed our headshot damage, so now we don't get a 1-shot kill to the head in the second damage range, only the first damage range. And then on top of that, our second damage range values were nerfed across the board. And pre-patch, you could get a 2-shot kill with a limb shot combined with a lower torso shot, whereas now that's not going to work for you anymore, so it's going to be a little bit less forgiving with that 2-shot kill within that specific damage range. Additionally, they nerfed our damage ranges a little bit with the Tempus Torrent. It still has an excellent range profile though, so I wouldn't say that this like destroyed the gun by any means. However, it is a bit unfortunate that we can now only get a 1-shot kill to the head in the first damage range rather than the first 2 damage ranges. As for the SMG category, let's start this off with the BAS-P, and with this one, we saw a slight improvement to all of our damage ranges, which you can see there. That is great to see. And on top of this, they improved our aim walking movement speed. It's now 3.38 meters per second, and this was already a really solid value pre-patch. So the BAS-P is now just going to be that much better after this patch. After that, we have the Lachmann Sub, and with this, they nerfed our headshot damage across the board, but this really isn't going to affect a whole lot of situations. We still have a very solid headshot damage profile here. But on top of this, they did adjust our damage values when switching into the burst fire mode, which you don't even need an attachment for on this gun. And the main benefits here are in our maximum damage range, it's now a 3-shot kill anywhere in the torso rather than just with upper torso shots mixed in. And then our second damage range, we have a 4-shot kill potential anywhere in the torso. Whereas again, previously, we would have to mix in upper torso shots in order to make that happen. To top that off, they also reduced the burst delay from around 80 milliseconds down to about 60 milliseconds. Keep in mind, these are hand-tested values, and it is difficult to get perfectly accurate hand-tested values for burst delays. But overall, I would say this makes the burst mode on the Lachmann Sub a lot more viable than it was pre-patch, even though I'd probably still stick to using full auto with this gun, and that headshot damage nerf really doesn't change a whole lot. Next up, let's move into the MX9, and this may seem like a very minor change here, but what they've done is they've finally improved our sprint out time to match all of the other SMGs in the game. Pre-patch, this had the same sprint out time as assault rifles, and that was a big thing that held the MX9 back. In fact, it's only that and the fact that it has a 25-round magazine instead of 30-round magazine that set this behind many of the other SMGs. But now that we have SMG-level sprint out times, the MX9 is actually looking like a very attractive option in the SMG category, so much so that I'm actually planning on investigating this further with attachment selections to see if it's actually viable in ranked play, because I think it may be viable as an alternative, but not a replacement for the Vaznev. And speaking of the Vaznev, this one did catch a headshot damage nerf here. But just like with the TAQ-56 headshot damage nerf, this really only impacts some very specific shot combinations at longer ranges. In the vast majority of gunfights you find yourself in, you won't be able to notice any difference whatsoever with the Vaznev. And it's a really similar story with the VEL-46. They did nerf our headshot damage a little bit across the board. But again, this wasn't a really significant change, and therefore it's only going to impact some very specific shot combinations at mid to longer ranges. As for the next thing I wanted to cover in the patch notes, they did mention that for submachine guns, they increased the hipfire accuracy, and I tested this pre-patch versus post-patch with all of the SMGs, and standing still at least, the only one of them that had their hipfire spread changed was the mini BAC, and you can see here pre-patch versus post-patch, that is a very noticeable improvement. And then another thing I noticed is while moving at maximum walking speed, the Vaznev hipfire was improved very slightly here. So despite how this sounds on the patch notes, this didn't appear to be an across-the-board buff to hipfire spread on all SMGs. Perhaps there are some edge cases, like maybe while jumping or sliding or something like that, that did improve across the board for SMGs, but it's simply not viable for me to collect data on literally every single hipfire potential combination for all of the guns. And then finally, for the weapon adjustments in this update, the Fennec 45 with the double tap mod specifically saw a bunch of changes. Now we can see here a lot of our headshot damage values have been nerfed aside from in our minimum damage range at the longest ranges possible. However, basically all of our other damage values have been improved when using the double tap mod. And on top of that, our burst delay was reduced slightly from 120 milliseconds down to roughly 100 milliseconds, again, based on hand testing. And overall, these are actually some really excellent buffs to the double tap mod, especially when you start to stretch out to really long ranges. Pre-patch with upper torso shots in the minimum damage range, it would take up to 9 bullets to kill, whereas post-patch, it's now only going to take you 5 shots to kill to the upper torso at those ranges. So that right there is a massive improvement to the double tap mod. It's no longer completely useless beyond like 38 meters, but it is also worth noting here, there were some range adjustments and they did nerf our damage ranges a little bit. But when you look at all of the changes combined, I do consider this to be a fairly significant net buff to the Fennec 45 with the double tap mod. And with that, that's finally going to wrap it up for all of the weapon-specific changes that were made with the Season 3 update. There are still several miscellaneous changes, including some hidden changes that I do want to cover in some future updates coming up. Also, the gun guides for the new weapons will be right around the corner. And this is where I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. What are you guys thinking about these weapon balancing changes they made with Season 3? Do you think these were generally good changes, bad changes? Were there any weapon balancing changes you were hoping for that we didn't see? Just let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.